All right, welcome to Monsterology, and today we are going, let's see, down under to Australia to learn about the bunyip. Not well known up here in the States, but very famous in Australia. In fact, in 1891, Australian author Rosa Pride writes a short story called The Bunyip, and she says, quote, "Everyone who has lived in Australia has heard of the bunyip. It is the one respectable, flesh-curdling horror of which Australia can boast. The old world had her tales of ghoul and vampire, of Lorelei, spook and pixie, but Australia has nothing but her bunyip." End quote. And this sounds like she's vaguely embarrassed that they just have the bunyip. Anyway, it turns out to be a very interesting creature. It's got a lot of great ingredients that go into it. We're going to be looking at, one of the theories is that possibly elephant seals from the Antarctic Circle made their way to Australia during rutting season. I mean, this very exotic and strange creature in the waterways there may have been one of the seeds of the legend of the bunyip. It was well known among Aboriginal peoples long before sort of the Western settlers came and continued the story in the 1830s and 40s. Also very interesting, there's going to be some cave spelunking and adventuring to dig up one of the great megatherium creatures of the ancient past. This was a real creature, a gigantic wombat that lived in Australia. And this seems to have had an influence also on the story of the bunyip. So today, the Australian bunyip. All right, here you can see the final image I came up with. It's obviously very playful, whimsical style, and you'll see how I got there. It's basically a couple of Victorians running away from the creature. Australia has a lot of cute stuff like koalas, but obviously a lot of stuff that wants to kill you as well. So you want to think about the creepier parts of Australia, these watering holes, the jungle areas, the sort of mysterious side of Australia with the more dangerous kinds of creatures. And the word bunyip is a translation from an Aboriginal term which I guess means devil or evil. And this is it was fairly common for people to describe a creature living in these watering holes that was large, dark, in the water mostly, fairly quiet, occasionally crying out and screaming, and it basically would attack people and kill them. That was the legend. There were a large number of sightings, in fact, reported in the 1940s and 50s, as early as the 1930s, during a sort of a time when there's a lot of colonial development. What I'm doing here, if you can see, I'm drawing a fairly important character. This is a man named George Rankin who lowered himself down into the Wellington Cave and discovered some bones of a giant creature there, which came to be called the Diprotodon. But the legend is he tied a rope to a protuberance coming out of the side of the wall of this cave, and it turned out to actually be a bone. So here I've tried to capture him going down into this, which just strikes me as a fairly heroic thing to do. He goes down into this deep, murky cave and discovers these bones. It turns out to be the largest known marsupial, and he sends this to a very famous scientist in England. Oh, here I've changed the color to black and white. I really love the way this turned out. It's incredibly moody, and I used that roller technique with the acrylic washes. The person you're seeing me draw here as a portrait is Richard Owen, and Owen is in England, and he's a famous naturalist at this time. He receives the bones, examines them, and determines that he gives it the name Diprotodon, which means two front teeth, and he identifies it as a extinct giant wombat that roamed the earth, in Australia during the Pleistocene era. If you're interested in monsterology or natural history or evolution theory, Owen is extremely important because he took over the Hunterian Museum from a naturalist named John Hunter from the 18th century, and that Hunterian collection is still available. You can still go see it in London. Owen was a friend of Darwin, and they were friends in the 1830s, and when Darwin returned from the Beagle, he brought these other megatheria bones, these giant mammals that had once lived during the Pleistocene era, the giant sloth and mammoth. And Owen helped him sort of identify what they were, and so they were pals at first, but eventually they became enemies over the evolution question. Darwin was sort of tilted towards, obviously, his own theory, natural selection. He suggested that organisms are always deviating from the norm, and Owen wanted to celebrate the common structures, like in vertebrates, for example. He called all vertebrates, he said they all have a common archetype, and you can see that archetype of structure in all the different animals. He got kind of theological about it and said, well, that's kind of God's ideas. God's thoughts about nature represent these archetypes, and then the evolution works out, the specific deviations. We don't think that's true really anymore. We went the route of Darwin's natural selection, but I have to say that some of Owen's ideas about an archetype may be vindicated in more recent ideas from what's called evo-devo, or evolutionary developmental theory. So we've discovered these Hox genes, which seem to control the body plan of large taxa, So there's some interesting stuff there if you're interested in the history of evolution theory. Here I'm trying to draw the Diprotodon. I basically looked at an articulated skeleton, and I laid in this acrylic wash, and then I used Prismacolor to kind of sketch it out and pull some of the details. I liked how creepy it sort of turned out. So anyway, that's one of the theories of the bunyip, is that it's either a living Diprotodon, if you're really a cryptozoologist, or you think it's just the bones of this ancient animal. The other major theory is that what people could have been describing in these watering holes in Australia are errant southern elephant seals. And so here I'm drawing a southern elephant seal. They're massive creatures, and they occasionally during rutting season find their way as far north as Australia, and they can get up into the river systems there, although it's very rare. So it's possible that Aboriginal people were seeing this, and it would have been very frightening, and so they would have considered it a monster. So that could be one of the explanations of the bunyip. These elephant seals are remarkable. They can grow almost 20 feet in length. They can weigh 8,000 pounds. They eat squid and fish, sharks, rays, and they dive really deep when they hunt, and so they actually expel oxygen and gases from their bodies. Otherwise, they'd get the bends, like divers will get nitrogen narcosis, and so to maintain oxygen levels, they store oxygen in the hemoglobin in their muscles, and they have twice the volume of blood of land mammals that are the same size. Their blood contains like 50% more of the hemoglobin. These things are relatively harmless, but the males fight for dominance and for access to females, and when they battle, it can go on for months. Battling elephants use their weight and their teeth against each other. They can sometimes kill each other. At the very least, they leave some pretty bad cuts. So in terms of natural monsters, this thing strikes me as particularly frightening. They can dive very deep. And here I'm doing this drawing based on an old black and white image I saw of a guy training an elephant seal. And I couldn't find the backstory on it, but I thought it made a nice drawing. Again, I used acrylics and then Prismacolor pencils and watercolors too to draw it out. And then it's interesting that there's actually some quote-unquote physical evidence for the bunyip. And here I'm drawing one of the pieces of so-called physical evidence. This is a skull that was supposedly discovered in the 1840s, and you can still see it on display at the Macleay Museum at the University of Sydney in Australia. This thing was examined by specialists, I think including Richard Owen, and it was identified in fact as a deformed fetal skull of a foal or a calf. So it looks fairly exotic and strange, monstrous, but it's in fact a teratology specimen of a birth defect in a horse, probably. So here you see me starting this rather whimsical version. I figured after all that sort of hard work and realistic portraits of Owen and so forth, I thought I would do something much more comical, and it's got kind of a folk art and cartoon quality to it. I took a lot of the ideas that I learned from this research and put them into it. You've got sort of a cowboy on the left and an Aboriginal guide here on the right, and I'm imagining they've just come across the Bunyip, in some swampy region, and so I'm trying to convey them as the thing, surges out of the water, ready to attack them. I've got them basically running away here in this, and here I'm doing this in a digital format, so I'm using the iPad Procreate program, and I basically draw using the iPencil, using essentially the same techniques I would use with a real pencil and paint. But the wonderful thing is I get to do these layers in this program. It got me thinking about, the mischievous taxidermists of the 18th and 19th century. There's a pretty funny story of a guy named Charles Waterton who did a lot of exploring in South America in the 1820s. And he's the guy that described the sloth. And when he wrote the description of the sloth back to the British scientific societies, they all laughed and said, no, this can't be right. An animal that hangs upside down all day, that sounds impossible. But Waterton got his revenge by creating these sort of fake monsters and then sending them back to the British Society. And at this time, there was some crazy stuff. People did not believe that the platypus was real. We didn't really understand what was real and what was fake, and so Waterton had a laugh by making some fairly good taxidermy hoaxes and getting them entered into the scientific literature in the middle of the 19th century. He did something called a noctifer, which was part eagle and owl and heron. He made a monkey, because he was Catholic, he called this monkey privately Martin Luther after his fall, which was a roast on the Protestants. Anyway, it's kind of fun to see that these taxidermy monsters were put to political use by some of these sort of rebels of the field. All right, so I'm drawing this image to a close here, and I think you can see that it's got a lot of the elements from the story that I've been telling all along here. I like the way it's turned out. I think that's kind of got a ridiculous feel to it. I was going for something in between, cartoon and folk art, and for the most part, I'm pleased with it. So that's The Legend of the Bunyip, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like this kind of thing, please hit subscribe and come back for more. I'm going to be working on the next one and putting that out probably next week, so stay tuned for more. As always, keep a lookout for the monsters.